Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first appointment of this year's Archive Online Academy, the free training program of the Digital Center Archive at Fondazione Giorgiocini, dedicated to the field of digital humanities. We're very glad to see so many of you join us today, and we thank you for your interest and your presence. The program began back in 2020. Since then, every year it has offered classes, talks, workshops, courses, and presentations devoted not only to digital preservation and the enhancement of digital cultural heritage, but also to the many perspectives and practices of digital humanities and new technologies. It's a great pleasure to open this New Year's series with an extraordinary guest, Albert-László Barabási, one of the most influential voices in the study of complex networks and data science. He will guide us today into the world of connections and structures with his lectures, Hidden Patterns, the Visual Journey of Networks. Before we begin, just a few practical notes. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance, you can follow the instructions that will be shared in the chat. For your questions and comments, feel free to use the chat anytime. We will dedicate a moment at the end of the lecture to address them to Laszlo. Please note that the lecture is being recorded and will be published on the Fondazione Giorgiocini YouTube channel, so you will be able to revisit it and share it. And finally, to stay updated on the next events, you can subscribe the archive newsletter or follow us on Instagram at Fondazione Cini or Centro Archive. Once again, thank you for being here with us today. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Albert-László Barabási.
Hello there, and thank you very much for having me here. So good afternoon, everyone. I realize that is in Europe, right? I'm right now in Boston, which means that it's kind of morning-ish for us. And what I wanted to kind of share with you today is really a journey between science and art. And you know, I know this Fondazione Gini is actually in Venice, and this is a program kind of rooted in Venice. So let's start in Venice, and then kind of if you happen to be going this year to the Venice Biennale, you would actually be encountered in Giardini with this giant network that is kind of covering up the facade of the big curatorial building, the big exhibition hall that is currently under construction. And instead, there is the Constructing La Biennale project that we actually built starting from last September that kind of captures the history of the Biennale, at least in the architecture space. And so the question is, what is it and why is it there, right? And what does it represent? And how does a scientist, a physicist to be more precise, which is what I am, get to the point to build something like of that scale at such a prominent event like the Biennale? And to be very clear, I was trained as a scientist and I identify as a scientist, and my research is network science, meaning that, you know, my lab has been studying in the last kind of almost 30 years now, the structure of the internet is what you see here or here, how routers are connected to each other by physical cables, the structure of organizations, how people are connected within the same company, even though if they're in different location. And my lab is very focused here at the Harvard Medical School into understanding the subcellular networks within your cell. And I should have turned the sound off here, but anyway, kind of describing how the molecules are connected to each other, and focused also right now and momentarily on the structure of the brain as a network. And really kind of I run a research lab in size everywhere between 10 to 30 people, depending on the time you look, where we focus on these very large, very complex structures. So if we're scientists, and that's what we originally trained, how comes that we are at the Biennale and we are kind of invited to an event like here at the Fondazione Cini? And the main reason has to do with the fact that before I became a scientist, I was dreaming and studying to become an artist. And this was, of course, in the 1980s. And I was hoping to become a sculptor. And and I was doing the regular things that someone did back then in Eastern Europe, in Romania, in Transylvania, to be precise, to actually go to art school. I would do everything from molding, sculptures, all the way to learn drawing and art history and so on. But then in the 1980s, it became very clear that during the communism, during the Ceausescu's dictatorship, there was really no path to art school. That is, in order to get into an art school, into sculpture, which I believe had five spots in the country, you would have to try to, get admitted year after year, and typically people got in 10 years later, almost never directly. I guess I didn't have the patience for that, so I took an easy way out, and I became instead a nuclear scientist. And what it meant is that I went to physics in Bucharest and eventually moved to Budapest, got my PhD at Boston University in a very short time. And and then after my PhD, I was hired by IBM. Until then, I was mainly working actually on lots of different things in the area of theoretical statistical physics. I was a traditional physicist, theorist within physics. And then at IBM, I had a major change in direction. And the change came from the fact that working at IBM, I became curious. What does IBM really do? And through that question, I started to read about computer science. As a physicist, I didn't know much computer science except using computers. And then I realized that much of the computer science has to do with how the computers are being wired and how algorithms being wired. And through that kind of journey, I encountered the concept of network. And I got so excited about it that I decided, well, pretty much 3 months into my job at IBM, that I will start focusing from now on networks. And interestingly, the very first product of that research was not a mathematical formula, was not a research paper, but rather it was a visualization, is what you actually see over here, which is, and I can very precisely date this because there was on the printer actually the date printed back then. The printer automatically printed on the page the date at which it was printed. So this is January 14, 1995. And eventually this network representation, who visually looks very much like a lattice, which is kind of close to my area where I was working on, turned out to begin a journey that kind of kept me in the networks since then. And the product of that eventually became a paper, my first network-related paper published kind of 2 years later in 1996. And it was this journey that eventually got transferred and entered the art space. And so that you see, this is the network that I did in 1995 in January. And this is another manifestation of it now in the museum space in Ludwig Museum as the opening work of our retrospective exhibition over there. Now the question comes, how do you go from a scientist to ending up in the museum? And that will be the journey that I will explain next to you. So fundamentally, as I said, I was working first at IBM for only 1 year. After that, I became a professor at University of Notre Dame. And I was relatively young at that age. I was only 26 when I was named professor. And I took advantage of the perk the university has offered, which is as a faculty, you could take free courses in any department of the university. So I started to fill in the gap that I had in my art education, and I started systematically taking arts classes. As I was taking the arts classes from history of art to photography, even lab work and so on, I started to realize that some of these ideas that I'm learning are really useful for our research on networks that was just emerging in my lab. So we started to actually bring the ideas that I was learning in the art school into our daily research. And the first product of that was this image, which became eventually very famous, which was the first representation, like a nice and aesthetic representation of the protein interaction network within a cell, in this case, within the yeast. The yeast is the baker's yeast, the one that you use to actually bake bread. And here the nodes correspond, the circus corresponds to proteins within the cell, and the links corresponds to experimentally validated interactions between them. But that's beyond the point. What was the point is that we were working research-wise on analyzing the properties of these networks, developing the tools to analyze these networks, but then we also started to develop the visual tools to analyze these networks. And the visual language was very simple, just nodes colored, connected by straight links. But you would say, oh, this looks nice. Was it always like that? And this was a journey. And just to kind of show you how the journey converged, right? We started out originally with a representation that was closer to the image that I created a few years earlier back at IBM. Then we started to make it a little bit less lattice-wise, then more organic, and then eventually we converged to this final structure. And it was this project, when I formulated to my research lab, that a good data visualization, in this case, a good network visualization, has to have multiple properties. First, it has to be scientifically accurate, but at the same time, it has to stand on its own. And what I mean by standing on its own, that if I take out of the research paper and in the context in which it was actually emerged, it should still have a presence and should be interesting of its own. And this was the first situation where we succeeded with that and helped us formulate that principle. This ended up on the cover of multiple books, and many events were kind of, when it came to networks, using this network to represent the field as a kind of visual representation. And then the next project that was kind of this category there was to look at genomics. And kind of about 10 years after my into Notre Dame presence, I went first for a sabbatical at Harvard Medical School. And this was around 2005, 2006, and it was the time that the Genome Project was just released a few years earlier, and its results were starting to show in the research lab. And I was at the medical school, so many of my colleagues were geneticists, and they were just discovering, as I was there, many genes related to diseases. And it was the moment also when people started to realize that there is no such a thing as one disease, one gene correspondence. There is never a single gene responsible for a disease, but the same gene can be responsible for multiple diseases, and any disease has actually involved many different genes. So we wanted to represent this idea, and that led to actually to this kind of disease network where we started to connect diseases if the same gene was responsible for both of them. That is, mutations on the same gene could cause both of them. And this was a journey. This is how in 2012, 2005, kind of the whole thing looked like as we're trying to build this network. Then it looks very much like the previous protein interaction network, except that we started to vary the node sizes to represent degree. And then kind of like, like a few months later, like a month later, this is how this looked, how it kind of converged. We started to encode information into the nodes, what kind of diseases they are, and eventually converged to this particular map, the human disease network, that had a tremendous impact actually on the way people think about disease gene associations. And that ended up in the not only being published as a poster by the very prestigious National Academy of Sciences in the US, but it also became a map that emerged and still is on the wall of many research labs and institutions. And not only that, but kind of lately has also emerged in the art space. This is how we actually were showing this particular work at our retrospective exhibition at ZKM in Karlsruhe. And briefly, I'm going to show, and I'm going to come back to that we're always searching for different ways of representing the same data. So the network that I'm showing here, the human disease network, has also manifestations in 3D. The left-hand side, you see a 3D printed color version. On the right-hand side, you see a black and white version, 3D printed. And to understand how do you go from these two-dimensional maps, what you see over here, to these three-dimensional structures, we need to talk about the concept of the data sculpture. So what is data sculpture for us and how did it come around? And that's really the question I'm going to try to tackle next. And as I mentioned in the introduction, in high school, I wanted to become a sculptor. And however, much of the work that we've been doing in the lab, in what you would call data visualization, was really in the air, was using the screen as kind of our medium. So, and it was very, very difficult to step out of the two-dimensional space and move into three dimensions, mainly because we lacked the algorithms to lay out the network in the three-dimensional space. This is not to say that there were no kind of algorithmic tools to do a three-dimensional networks, but they were actually suffering from some major problems that I'll show you in a second, that it was good enough to show it on a screen, but it was never good enough to actually create a sculpture for that. So I started working on the idea of data sculptures back in 2005, 2006, when I was here at Boston, at Harvard. And I started a collaboration with people at the MIT Media Lab to try to develop first in the virtual space. And that collaboration ended without us achieving our goals. And around 2016, I realized, okay, I was again now back to Boston permanently, both at Harvard Medical School as well as Northwestern University, where I run a center on network science. And then I said, now I have to kind of figure out the way to do that. And for that, I realized one of the reasons we were not succeeding is that we're trying to solve a very complicated mathematical and algorithmic problems with the tools of sculptures. And really, the tools should not come from art. They need to come from science. So I started this research project that ended up being published in the Nature magazine, which, as you probably know, one of the most prestigious magazines out there. And you can see on the cover, actually, some of our first 3D printed kind of three-dimensional networks. And on the right-hand side, you actually see the mathematical article that describes how do you do that. And I'm not trying to scare you, but the idea behind that, how you build an aesthetically three-dimensional network that does look like a sculpture, is that you need to formulate it like a mathematical problem. And that is really the math behind building the sculptures that I'm going to show you next. Why do we need that math? One of the reasons we did need that math is because there were algorithms before to build networks in 3D, but they suffered from the problem that they have not really considered the physicality of these. And this is kind of illustrated here on the left-hand side, that the nodes or the links and the nodes could cross each other without any penalty. So, which is fine if you look at on your screen at the network. However, if you want to actually build a sculpture out of this, the links must avoid each other. They cannot cross without impunity each other. So we needed to build a methodology by which the links recognize each other and they would nicely and smoothly avoid each other. And that methodology is in that particular function that I showed you earlier, which is an energy function that penalizes link and node crossing. And once you implement it, this is what the network will do, right? Now the links do not cross, but avoid each other. And here I'm showing this in a small scale. The question is, what happens if I do it in a larger scale? And for that, I'm going to use a fun network that my lab has been working on in 2010, which is kind of what we call the flavor network. And it is what it sounds. So the nodes are different dishes in our, not dishes, but ingredients in our food. Ginger, cumin, pepper, and so on. Olive oil, of course, and olive, and so on. And then they are connected if they share the same flavor chemical. What is the flavor chemical? The flavor chemicals are the volatile chemicals that are in the food that are responsible for the taste and the smell of the food. They're mostly smell molecules, mainly volatile molecules, because as you know, only 4 tastes are tasted by the mouth and by the tongue. The rest of the taste receptors are in our nose, and we really taste through the smell. And this has been categorized, and people have actually have created books that tell you what are the flavor chemicals in the olive oil or in cilantro. And we use that to kind of build this network, mainly because molecular cuisine had an underlying hypothesis at that time. It was just exploding as a form of cuisine. And their hypothesis was that two ingredients taste well together if they share the flavor chemical, say a flavor chemical. So it's a little bit like color matching in a room, that if you have actually the same color patches here and there, it feels coherent. When it comes to flavor, if the different ingredients share 1 or 2 flavor chemicals, then the dish feels coherent. And one of the best example of that is lasagna. Virtually all the components of the lasagna, all the ingredients of the lasagna share flavor components with all the other components of it. So, but this is a two-dimensional network, which has some advantages. You can actually label the nodes, but it also makes it difficult to see who is connected to whom. And really, networks are fundamentally three-dimensional objects because in 3D, we can lay out a network without crossing. So we ended up using this algorithm to lay this network out as a sculpture. And what I'm going to show you next on the slide is how the algorithms and the computer that I showed you earlier is actually finding the structure. So now you can see the computer working. Of course, this is a video of that, and trying to find out how to lay this network out. And that's what that massive formula does to you. And eventually it converges to a structure where there are very clear communities, and I'll tell you about those communities, and that are kind of densely interconnected, and they have some relative relationship to each other. So that's what that mathematical formula did for us. That's how it kind of helped us to kind of lay this network out. And one of the product of this layout was that now we could take this network and we can 3D print it. And as a result, it became a network like that. This is how it was displayed actually at ZKM in the museum, a 3D printed version of this network along with the formula that produced that in the background. And now you can see the different communities. Different communities correspond to different ingredient types like fish, different type of fishes, different type of meats, cheese, grains, and so on, and then how they actually eventually connect to each other. And then, of course, this thing was not only shown as a sculpture, but next to the sculpture, we were also showing the map itself. So now I'm looking from the sculpture perspective, and then across from that map, you could actually see the formula that produced it, the product, as well as the evolution of the network, how it went from some randomly connected nodes to the final structure that you see over here. Now, when you look at this, there's one major problem, right? If you actually look at this network, the nodes are labeled, so you know which node is what. However, when you go to the sculpture representation, that information disappears. The question became, could we bring this one back to the viewer? Could we let them kind of enjoy the sculpturality of this network as it is without noise? But those who are curious, what are the nodes and how they connect to each other, could they see it? And for that, we built like an augmented reality tool that through the phone or an iPad in this case, will let you actually click on the nodes. It would latch to the three-dimensional structure and then allow you to click on the nodes, and it will tell you explicitly, which node is what kind of foods they represent. And let me just show you again what foods they represent, and even information about those foods, where do you find it, and so on. So this is some way to kind of go back to the content from these otherwise beautiful and very structurally interesting data sculptures and regain the underlying content behind that. Now, one interesting outcome of this research was a prediction, which is kind of the networks that I showed you had very thin links that were connecting nodes that were far away from each other, something like what you see over here. But we were curious, how does the network change when the links are becoming thicker and thicker, because in many networks, the link thickness varies. So part of the research was to explore that. And now you're kind of seeing what happens with the network as I'm thickening the links. And you see that when the links are thin, they can go straight to their destination. When they become thick, they can no longer actually follow a straight line, and they must curve. And that mathematical formula that I showed you earlier allows for this curving. So everything that you see came out from that mathematical framework. And we ended up calling this object the Gurkha because it was so aesthetically interesting of its own. And it's also relevant for us because it turns out that the brain, the way it's wired, it's much closer to this than the delta sculpture that you saw earlier. And why is that? It's not that because our neurons are thick or fat, but that's because they're so dense that the neurons must avoid each other, and as a result, they must curve locally to find the journey to their destination. So, so as a result, we kind of end up with this very interesting object of its own, the extreme opposite to the network, the data structure I showed you earlier. So one of the experimentations we do in my lab is to find out what is the medium and what is the material that best represent that particular content. And that's not always the computer screen, and most of the time is not the computer screen. And in order to show that, we started to experiment with this form and say what material would be appropriate for that. And in order to see that, first we actually made it out of ceramics, which is kind of what you see here on the right-hand side, which is naturally kind of giving itself, give it the color structure. On the back, you actually see the 3D printed plastic version. But then, then, as I mentioned, when I was studying to become a sculptor, I was taking classes in sculpting. And my professor, long retired actually, was still working in Transylvania as a sculptor. So I went to him and I asked him, would you be interested in realizing this particular shape in marble, which is one of the mediums he worked in? And he did so. He worked several months on it and ended up creating the version here on the front, which is roughly the same shape exactly what we had here because he used that as an inspiration, but is now made of marble. And I like actually this picture because it shows the contrast between what he did for us and what his normal work is, which is kind of in the back, which is a very traditional figurative art, kind of rooted in the 1970s and 80s in Transylvania. So this was actually, he did it for us 3 years ago. Sadly, kind of a year after he finished this work, he passed away. So this is kind of my memento from the journey that I've been taking, learning sculpture from him, and eventually ending with realizing one of the works that kind of emerged from my lab 50 years later. And then, of course, this network, as I showed you in the video, is the result of we are inflating the links. So we wanted to also create a form where this inflation is obvious. So we built a version made out of tubes, and you can actually see it in an exhibit in the rain. So these are giant tractor tubes that are inflatable, and is shown in the courtyard of a museum that is now explicitly kind of close to its initial spirit, which is kind of this is an inflated network, and hence, it's kind of really gives that idea, makes that idea very, very explicit. And then part of the journey, the final step of this one, that I worked with another artist who kind of made it out of wood as well, more like continuing to experiment with the form. So let me stop here and kind of think a little bit about for a pause, or more like pause rather than stop, and then ask ourselves, what exactly are we doing, right? And you could say that, like there is lots of artists out there who work at the interface of science and art. And the vast majority of the work I would consider to be based on appropriation, which is appropriation is a kind of like a term that art uses to kind of reflect the fact that you can take objects and ideas from outside of the art and move it into the art space and effectively label them as artwork in the proper context. The appropriation in many ways started with Marcel Duchamp, who was the first to actually take a couple of ordinary objects like the hat holder and other things and move and exhibit them as artworks. And now, of course, in the contemporary and particularly in the conceptual artwork, it has a very important role. So that would be traditional appropriation, moving from outside of the art to art. And particularly, there is a flavor of that within the science and art interface where many artists take formulas, they take shapes coming out of the art of the scientific world or concepts like entanglement, and then they use that to create artworks. I felt like, and this is the formally, artists using pre-existing images and concepts of science to move them into the art space. I think what we've been practicing in my lab, in my studio, is what I call reverse appropriation. Instead, we are scientists, and even though we have artists and designers working within my lab, and what we do instead is that we actually appropriate the visual language of art and of artistic mediums to express ideas, forms, and data that emerge in the scientific context. So the information goes in the opposite way. It is really bringing the tool set and the thinking of the artwork space into the scientific space and kind of creating works that simultaneously work in the scientific space and the art space. But with all honesty, for about 20 years, much of the work we did in that space was not intended for the art space, was intended for the science space, and our canvas was typically the cover of the journals because many of these images could not actually go into the research paper. Some of them do, but most of them didn't. So we commissioned, we built images to illustrate our work that ended up often in the cover of the major scientific journals to accompany our papers. So in many ways, the covers of the journals were our canvas. And during the 20 years, kind of looking back, we were not just doing network representation. We were by necessity developing the visual language of networks. And what do I mean by that? Pretty much from 1994, when the first image, and I should have put it there, that square lattice and has emerged, till kind of the more recently, we were always discovering new ways of representing the networks, right? In 2000, all the networks representation including our own, kind of were simple network representations like that, were equal-sized nodes connected by very uniform links. Before 2000, us and everybody else was representing networks mostly as lattices, as I did in my very first image. But then in 2000, we started to develop this organic representation that kind of to show networks as they are, laying out not as a lattice, but as an organic material layout, architecture. Then in 2004, we also started to color the links to encode information on that. It was in 2007 with the disease network where we started to vary the node sizes as well to encode information now in the size of the node. And then in 2011, we started to curve the links so that they can avoid the nodes in the two-dimensional representation so that it gives more visual clarity and less clutter. And eventually in 2018, we started to pioneer the data sculptures where we developed the algorithms to take the network out of 2 dimensions and move to where it belongs in a 3-dimensional space where links can find the nodes without crossing each other, which is not possible in 2D. And so the reason we were developing these tools wasn't because we had this aggressive program that we have to develop the visual language of networks, but because of necessity. We were encountering new and new data sets and new ideas that had to be represented. And as we're trying to represent it, we're discovering new ways of using networks to carry information. But as I said, much of this actually was happening in the art space, I mean, in the science space. And then, to my surprise, around 2015, I think, I got a request for these two maps, the 2007 and 2011 maps, by somebody from England that I have never heard of at that moment, who said, I would like to exhibit your maps in my gallery. And I said, sure, I don't know what your gallery is, but here are the PDFs of the file. Free to exhibit them, print them at the size you want. You can print it at any size. So I haven't heard anything about that. I did not even bother to figure out where was the exhibition or go to the exhibition. Then I kind of got, like a year later, another email saying, hey, we would like to do a catalog of the exhibition. Would you agree to include your images? And I said, sure, I already gave you the files. What else do you need from it? So then eventually they sent me the catalog, which was this. And what I learned from it later is that I had an exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery in London, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in London, curated by Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who at that time was the #1 curator in the world. And it's what's interesting because when you look at on the back of the book, it says with contributions from, and there are all of these people who were exhibited, and Tim Berners-Lee, Olli Ofanarpusson, Damien Hirst, Anish Kapoor, Yoko Ono, and others, and many others. And I guess I was one of the many others in this particular context. And this one, and then a few months later, actually, we got a request from the Hewlett Museum, the Design Museum in New York, to kind of exhibit some of our video that we did at that time in a different project. And eventually, a few months later, they came back and said they would like to purchase the video to enter the permanent collection of the museum, which it did. And then following that, I started to become curious, what is this really about? Why is the art world interested in that? Once I wanted to become an artist, but I'm not an artist, right? And how is possible that the art world is really kind of interested in our work? And one thing led to the other, and we were offered a big exhibition at first at the Ludwig Museum, that moved to the ZKM in Karlsruhe. And since 2000, which is kind of when this happened, we were now, oh no, 2020, when this happened, we were now actively part of the artwork, working with both museums and galleries. So this is how this transition happened. And now in my lab, we have at the same time, next to the scientists, we have artists and designers. And we kind of accept that many of the outputs don't only go to the arts, to the scientific space, but they are specifically tailored towards the art space. So what I'm going to do in my remaining time, which is we still have lots of time, I guess, is to tell you a few more projects that we kind of been doing in this space that have entered kind of at the interface of art and science, and more like in the kind of more recently and what we're doing right now. And eventually we will arrive to the Venice Biennale project where we started from. So in 2018, I got a very interesting phone call from the editor-in-chief of Nature. So as probably you know, Nature is one of the most influential, if not the most influential scientific journal out there. Publishing in Nature for scientists is something that makes your career. It is like having a big exhibition at MoMA or at Pompidou, right? That would be the equivalent in the art space. And so interestingly, the editor-in-chief came with the request that they said they are about to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the journal. So it kind of shows how, paradigmatic this journal is, been around for 150 years. And she was asking me, would I be interested to work with them to create the cover for the anniversary edition? And this request partly was stemmed from the fact that I showed you earlier. By then, I have done several covers or created images for several covers for Nature. But this was different because all of those images came out of my research lab and the science we're doing. This was, if you want to call it, like a commission, where they were asking us to create a new image for the purpose of the 150th anniversary. And of course, I gladly accepted because this is an opportunity that comes back only once every 150 years, right? So it's not something you can easily pass. And we worked for them for almost a year and 6 months very intensively to create this cover. At the end, it wasn't a one-page cover, it was a 5-page cover. And this is a fold-out cover that was 5 pages. And let me walk you through what did we do to kind of celebrate the 100 or 50-year anniversary of nature. First, we mapped out all the research papers that nature has published during the 150 years, which is roughly 80,000 papers, 88,000 papers to be more precise. And the nodes of these networks are the papers. So you have roughly 88,000 nodes on this network, which is massive. And most of the visualizations tools that exist cannot visualize a network of this size. So we had to kind of develop special tools for this purpose. But the question is, how do you link papers? And the straightforward thing to link papers is by citations. Who cites whom? But the reality is citation is a very recent phenomena. Citations in the scientific discipline exist since the 1960s only, and it's connected to the emergence of the Xerox and the emergence of the refereeing process. Before we had refereeing, we did not have actually the concept of citations. And it was the referees who kind of convinced the authors that they need to refer to other people's work and more work. And that's how the current habit has emerged. So that means that about half or more than half of the papers, right, that Nature published could not be connected by citations because they did not cite anyone or no one else in that neighborhood were citing each other. So instead, we used what we call co-citation. What is a co-citation? If you write today a paper and you cite 2 papers, those 2 papers are connected because you think that they are connected, right? Because you wouldn't have put both of them in your paper. If you write an art paper, you may put 2 art papers together. It's already signaling that those are both related to your subject and art. If you write a paper on superconductivity and you cite 2 superconductivity papers, you're signaling that those are related to each other. So we ended up finding all the papers. We analyzed the full scientific literature out there, which is hundreds of millions of papers, and identified every time a paper cited 2 Nature papers, and if they did, then we connected them. And those are the connections you see. The connections indicate that in the mind of the scientific community, these papers are connected, not necessarily because these 2 papers connect to each other. And so that's the network that you end up with. And the nodes corresponds to different fields. Actually, white nodes corresponds to papers related to art. And blue is actually biochemistry. Green corresponds to physics. I believe yellow is biology, and so on and so forth. And what you see on the cover is really a picture of a 3-dimensional object, a data sculpture, if you want, that was built with the same algorithms that I showed you earlier. And and this was really the original image, which we often show actually as hold on, we show it originally as a kind of a light box in museums, and I'll show you in a second. And this is the one where everybody takes their selfie in front of it because it looks very remarkable. And at the end, the project consisted of this image that ended up on the cover, but also the cover ended up being a 5-page cover. You see, so there was the fold-out cover, and in the back, we ended up putting a bunch of images because we ended up developing a bunch of ideas for potential covers that were by themselves interesting. And then we ended up telling that journey in the back of the cover in the 3 pages inside, as well as telling the visual language of the whole thing inside it. And as I said, this is not a 2-dimensional object, but it's a 3-dimensional object. So there was this particular video that is actually overvoiced and tells the story of what exactly this map shows. And this video was one of my major disappointments, not because I don't like the video, I love it, but one of the reasons I was very disappointed is that when we built this video, we did so because, as I said, it's an explanatory video, And Richard Attenborough has agreed to voice over that he would actually tell us what are we seeing on the video. And that was such a remarkable joy that he would do that. And when we finished the video, uh, and we had kind of a week to do the voiceover, the nature kept sending emails to Richard, tried to reach him, and they could not reach him. So at the end, we actually had to ask, they had to ask somebody else to do the voiceover, another British person. And then only later, a few weeks later, when finally Richard Attenborough managed to get back to them, he was very disappointed on one end that he couldn't do it. And it turns out that the only reason he didn't respond is because he does not read email. So they should have really called him, but it was too late by that time. But nevertheless, the video is now telling the story of what is being shown in this particular thing. And now, of course, when we have a larger exhibition, if the curator desires, we show this particular video as well, along with the light box you see on the right-hand side, the different elements. So all of these images came out from the Nature 150 cover. On the right-hand side, you see the cover in the light box. Here you see some preliminary versions, kind of the pre-designs black and white. This is what was at back of the cover. And on the left-hand side, a very, very early version of the render when we didn't even have colors and curvings and so on. So I like actually this room, which was at the Ludwig Museum, because it's not only showing the final image, but also shows the evolution of the project. Now, if we're staying with nice and colorful images, let me tell you about the different journey that we've been doing that in my lab. That also kind of created a very iconic image that is used very wisely. Oh, I'm sorry. This is kind of like, this is the Milano exhibit version of the same light box. You can kind of see it was all put in the hall of the museum, so you can actually even see it from our outside as well. And you can see that that on the right-hand side, you see the video. So this is often we like to show the light box together with the video so that they can come together. But now let's switch gears and talk about a different project, which is the Art Network, which kind of came at the same time. And the Art Network really, it was a research project in my lab. As I said, we are network scientists and we look at lots of data. And in my lab, there was a big project going on for many years on what we call the science of success, which is trying to understand data to understand the success of scientists mostly. That how do you use scientific data to understand the scientific enterprise? And around 2017, we realized that there's a big data set out there that allows us to ask the same question in the art space. That is, how do artists and which artists become successful, and how do networks contribute to that particular journey? And in order to do, the reason why we could do so is because we were given a very massive data set, similar to artifacts. Actually, part of it came from artifacts, if you are familiar with that, that covered exhibition data from 1980 to 2016. So you see, it's kind of like 40 years. And it was showing all the exhibition, not all that, a big number of exhibitions in 140 countries, and covered the exhibition history of about 400,000 artists. Altogether, we had data about 400,000, like almost 500,000 exhibits in 14,000 galleries, and about 250,000 exhibits in 7,800 museums. So both gallery and museum exhibits, and we also had some gallery auction data. And the question for us was, how do you use these massive data sets that kind of trails the evolution, the temporal evolution of the artistic trajectory to understand the career of an artist? And we ended up doing many things with this data, but the main thing we did is that we conceptualized this as a network. And how do you do that? To that, let's go to the career of one particular artist. Mart Grotjan is a very well-known contemporary artist, kind of the same age as I am. And he has been very successful. And you can actually see the fact that his average sales price for his work was about $500,000. And what you see is his career based on the data set that we had. And what it means that here you have time, and then you have this kind of red lines if you had in that period, if he had a museum exhibit, like here he had a MoMA exhibit in that time frame, like for several months. Then you had kind of blue lines if you had a gallery exhibit, like the Blum and Poe exhibit here in kind of 1999. And then as circles were showing the sales data, mostly from auctions, because gallery sales are not kind of appropriate. And it's also, he has played a very interesting role of managing his own career, which means that he would work not with one multiple galleries, but he was also very involved in kind of putting his works out for auction. So now you have all this data that trails one particular artist, and we have similar data sets for about 500,000 artists. Not all of them are as rich because not all artists had so many exhibitions, both in galleries and museums, but nevertheless, we have similar data sets for them. So now what we realize is that artistic success is partly determined by the institutions in which they exhibit their work, right? So it's no mistake that Mark Rojan is a very prominent artist, and hence his work has been exhibited in MoMA and many other major museums. And some of the top galleries like Gagosian represented them and showed their work. So the question is, how does the institutions contribute to the success of an artist? And to map out that, we had to understand how do artists travel between the institutions. And for that, we ended up reconfiguring the data of Mark Rojan in the following way. I showed you that in kind of 99, he exhibited in Plum and Bow. After that, he exhibited in Mocha. So therefore, there is a link between Plum and Bow and Poe and Mocha because the curators of these institutions think alike of who's the artist they have to represent, right? Or show. And then after that, he went to MoMA. And again, that kind of represents a link between all these three institutions. And after that, he was shown in Gagosian that links these institutions to Gagosian. What do these linkages mean? It indicates that these institutions agree that Mark Rojan is an artist that belongs to that. So it represents an aesthetics and a form of art that they can all agree on. And this is not obvious because not all institutions would show the same artists, right? Because if you are an institution that only shows black and white photography, then Mark Rojan is not a good artist for you, and you would not have works that are kind of only shown by these institutions. So we ended up building this one not only for him, but for all the artists. And from that, we ended up building a network between institutions, how often they're showing the same artist. And the end product was this map, where again, nodes now correspond to museums, museums and galleries. Colors corresponds to the region. So as you can see on the right-hand side, kind of United States are the big red nodes over here. And Germany are the lighter nodes, and UK are the lighter blue, and the UK over there. And then the size of the nodes corresponds to how central they are in this particular network. And that centrality, and two nodes are connected, that is, two institutions that are connected, if they frequently exhibit the same artist. So not only once, but they are by more than chance they exhibit the same artist. So we have a mathematical way to quantify that linkage. And what you can see that the network that emerges kind of maps out the whole artwork and tells us very interesting stories. This is where all the high-profile institutions are. This is kind of MoMA, this is Gagosian, this is Space Gallery, and then this is where you got Pompidou and Tate and so on. So all the very high-profile institutions are in that kind of big center. And that's where you want to end up if you want to say that I really made it in the art world. But there are many, many islands that are disconnected from that. Like I grew up in Eastern Europe, and this is the Eastern European cluster with hundreds of institutions, meaning that you can be an artist in Eastern Europe and be exhibited all your life, go from institutions to institutions. Some of them even end up in American institutions, which are the red one and Canadian one, but not have an easy path to arrive to this high cluster, because these linkages are the one that eventually allow you to go to these big clusters, right? And also you can be exhibiting in Oceania or Africa, and as if you are in a very different continent. So this map showed how clustered and fragmented the art world is. There is a high profile group of institutions that are very interlinked to each other. They keep showing the same artist. And then there is the rest of the art world, which forms clusters of their own with very few links to this central cluster. And among other things, we could actually use this map to ask where did you have your first 5 exhibitions? And we could use the map to predict where would you go next. And it actually turned out to be scarily accurate. But we don't, that's kind of a more scientific version of this talk. So, and so this map kind of took eventually of life of its own. So we had the first retrospective exhibition at the Ludwig Museum. It was shown more like on the wall, but eventually this was turned into a light box, and this was kind of our exhibition at Postmaster Gallery in New York, where it was again shown as the artwork, and it was kind of the opening work of the exhibition. And anyway, it's a very interesting map because it's an artwork about the art world, right? It's very self-reflective. You could consider to be a deep critique of the artwork world because it unveils these hidden networks that shape the artistic career and kind of shows the backbones of that institutional network, that we dress up with all these beautiful flowery works of how our artist succeeds, but really artists succeed by navigating successfully or less successfully this institutional network that is being unveiled over here. Now, with this one, we're slowly coming to the end of these projects that were kind of born at the interface of art and science. And what I'm going to do in the remaining time is to tell you a little bit more about some of the journey that we have right now, some of the more current projects that are happening both in my lab as well as in my studio, because now it will exist in this duality. And one of the most intensive projects for myself, for our studio, and this was really more like happening in Europe, I was doing this work in Budapest, is related to the paint rollers. So what is a paint roller project and why are we doing that? Virtually all the works that I showed you so far were works that emerged in the scientific context, data and networks, that were shown typically as two-dimensional plots that were printed on glass or on paper or you name it. And in a few cases, we turned them into three-dimensional sculptures. But one of the things I realized is that on one hand, the art world has always difficulty of dealing with these printed materials. It's a little bit like photography, right? Is that you can make many copies of it and you can multiply it, and often the art world doesn't know what to do with it, even when you do it in the limited edition and so on. But what the art world knows what to do with is canvas. So, but printing on canvas is really boring and cheap, right? So I was always curious, and I'd be thinking, how could you actually bring data-driven content onto a canvas in a way to be authentic and to have the fidelity to the original data and content? And a few years ago, I kind of realized that there is a medium or there is a tool that I could use for that purpose that goes back to my childhood. This is a family picture when I was a much younger man. I'm on the left-hand side with my son, who is now an adult in my hands. But what the most important thing I want to focus on is actually my grandparents on the right-hand side. My grandfather was a painter, not an artist, but rather a wall painter. And the wall that you see behind me was painted by him. And he did so using paint rollers. And me as a child, particularly in high school, I would make money by going and work with him, help him when he would paint people's houses, and kind of partly learn the trade and partly do something on my summer vacation. And he was using paint rollers like this. Some of them were actually hand carved. You actually see some very old paint rollers you can still find in Eastern Europe. And they would actually carry these kind of flowery shapes. And and so I kept thinking, this is a very interesting medium that we could revive to kind of create, to bring our content to walls and eventually canvases. And indeed, to do so, we ended up doing on the right-hand side, our own data-driven paint rollers. So what you see on the left-hand side are the classical paint rollers, the very old ones. On the right, that were handcrafted typically. On the right-hand side, you see our paint rollers that are 3D printed, and I'll explain you in like a second the content of what's on it. And how do we do that? We design it actually in 3 dimensions, and that's kind of what you see on the right-hand side, the paint roller. And then eventually we use 3D printers, and you see a 3D printer in action in my lab, printing one of the paint rollers over there. So we have a medium, or we have a way, or we have a tool, this is not our canvas, but it's more like our paintbrush that can now move content that emerges in the data space onto a flat surface. And the question is, what is the content? And in the last 3 years, we ended up doing each year a massive project in my studio in Budapest, where we would pick one particular content and use that content, do paint rollers on that content, and then effectively create art with those paint rollers. The first year was in 2023, and this was just, we were coming out of fake news, of the COVID. And so we ended up adapting the fake news, the COVID fake news to be more precise, as the topic of our investigation. Why COVID fake news? First of all, why fake news? As I said, my research is actually done in Boston. And here I funded the Network Science Institute at Northeastern University. And within that, we have many faculty. My lab is just one of the multiple labs in there. And one of my colleagues actually studies fake news, which means that they were at that time tagging every single Twitter message and identifying if it's fake or it's a correct statement. And we ended up using their data, but narrow it down to COVID fake news, because they were looking at political fake news and all type of fake news. But we felt like we wanted to do something universal, and the COVID is a universal human experience. No matter where you were in the world, you experienced it in a way or the other. And so through our data analysis, we ended up realizing that 70% of fake news messages on Twitter were attributed to 12 individuals. And we ended up calling them the fake news apostles. And one of them was Robert Kennedy, who is currently the health minister of United States. And for each of the 12 apostles, we created a paint roller and you see actually the Robert Kennedy paint roller over here. And each paint roller typically, they always had the Twitter name of the person, which is a public name, in his case, Robert Kennedy Jr., a keyword that he used and overused, and he was used the hashtag #TheDefender in many of his messages. The number of followers in this case, he had at that time 500,000 followers. This was before he became minister, now he has millions. And the 1,300, the smaller numbers correspond that he put out 1,300 messages that by the algorithms were classified as containing fake news, false messages about COVID. And so we had one for every single roller. And then, of course, the paint rollers ideally are designed to roll on walls, right? And this is me rolling with a different paint roller, the wall of the Postmaster Gallery, actually, in New York City for our exhibitions. But what we did, however, in the summer is that we would rent a giant studio, actually, and then I would have about 10 young artists working with me as assistants. And the question we asked, how could we use the paint rollers to create art where the artworks are in synthesis with the content of the paint roller. So that how do you take a particular content and put it on the canvas in a way that it's authentic and it resonates with the content. So this is actually on the right-hand side, me in that studio rolling a canvas. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing you actually using the same fake news rollers to roll the walls of the Ludwig Museum as a performance in Budapest, right? Of like how that actually project works. But really, I'm going to talk to you about the summer project that is on the right-hand side. And in this particular case, the question was, fake news is a very violent object. Like it uses very bright colors and it kind of overlays each other over and over. So then how do you actually represent that in the canvas? And the very first large canvas emerged from that particular journey was this one, which uses the Kennedy one. And you see that not only we're rolling a canvas, this is a 3x2 canvas, but as I was going left, I was rolling more and more, this kind of to represent the fact that once you click on one fake news, then the algorithms will give you more and more. So you will densely enter in that particular fake news space. There's no avoidance. Once you click on one, you are characterized as fake news consumer and you're going to get much more. So this was how we started that, this kind of monochromatic paintings. But then we realized this is not reflecting this bright color scheme that fake news carry, right? And the social media normally carries. So we ended up then switching over to neon colors. And also, once you click on one fake news that on the content of Kennedy, then the algorithms will give you content from other fake news spreaders, the other apostles. So now we started actually roll on top of each other the multiple rollers, right? To kind of create this cacophony of feelings, what you have if you go to the internet, then one message, one content after the other comes towards you. And if you are a fake news follower, then one fake news after the other one is finding you in different bright colors, fighting for your attention. So that was kind of the first year, the fake news year. The next year, we ended up kind of engaging with a different data set. The New York Public Library came to us and they proposed to work with them on analyzing the data that the library has and conceptualizing a project on that. And one of the projects we ended up conceptualizing around that had to do with banned books. What are banned books? Well, banned books is what it says, that the books that are being banned, and some of you may not be aware of it, but currently United States has a new renaissance of banning books. Mostly in the South, the Republican states end up banning books that have sexuality, gender issues, and so on. And even prominent books like Bluest Eye, a Nobel Prize winning work by Toni Morrison, one of the most prominent American writers, is currently banned in multiple states around the United States. So we did the same thing as with fake news. We ended up analyzing all the books that are currently banned in the United States and ranked what are the top 10 books that were banned in the States. And then for each of the book, we ended up creating a roller. And so, for example, Bluest Eye is currently banned in 12 different locations in the United States. And the roller we created has just the title because you don't need more. If you see Bluest Eyes, you know exactly that Toni Morrison, and has the number in which has been, how many states it has been banned. But we have ended up creating 10 rollers for that. And in 2024, we worked for 6 weeks in the studio in Budapest to use these rollers. But now the artistic challenge was the opposite. While in fake news, the artistic challenge was how you show this bright kind of fake news that wants to be in your face. In the banned book space, we chose the artistic challenge. How do you show something that everybody knows that it exists, but you are not allowed to show, that you must hide it? And for that purpose, we use much more monochromatic colors. And instead of rolling actually the content, we use the rollers to really kind of like to leave their mark in the thick paint. You see, this is one of the series we did, that we ended up kind of putting very thick layers of paint on the canvas and then rolling it over so that the roller is not bringing the paint on, but rather taking it away. And here effectively it smeared away the painting and took it in a different direction. So if you went close, you would actually discover the content. And this is actually on the right-hand side is a book that's called Hate You, right? That was the title. And that's the roller that we Hate You Give, actually the official title. And it was banned in 17 states. So if you actually go close, you will find it. On the left-hand side is a very famous book, Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, that is banned in 14 different locations in the United States. So if you come close, you will actually see the content, but for far away, you see these monochromatic colors. The other series we did is that we would just layer over and over and over the same roller so that effectively the content overlaid itself and disappeared. But if you actually came close, you could also see the content and what was that behind that. So these are kind of what we call the big monochromatic paintings. And inside the hole, that what you see over there, we show some of the other experiments that summer. We were also doing these book sculptures, kind of to represent the fact that, I'm from Transylvania, and putting things on stick has a big tradition over there, right? So in this case, we laid on the stick the books, which is kind of a deformation of the book, right? It's kind of, you feel hurt for doing that. But it also has this concept of banned book, because once you put it on a stick, you cannot read it. You can see, you know that book exists, as we know about the banned books. Everybody knows that in 1984 exists, even during communism, even though you were not allowed to read it, right? But you cannot read it. So like by putting in a stick, you kind of create this situation that the book is there, you know of its existence, but you cannot open it and access this content. And we were also experimenting this summer with other ways of showing this hidden content. Like, for example, we put them into clay and then we burn them out. So the book is in there, right? It's just not accessible any longer to you. And we were curious, what happens to the book inside? So one of these, we ended up actually breaking it apart to see what's inside. So now you will see our performance, or my performance, breaking that. And you can see the book is kind of still there. The content is in there. If you open up these fragile pages, you can still decipher the content, but it's no longer accessible. This is like the Vesuvius scrolls, right? If you touch it, you destroy it, what's inside it. And then finally, we're getting to the last year project that we just finished this summer. So let me go here. This is 2025, where I decided to engage with numbers. Well, of course, everything that we show so far is numbers, but here we talk about personal numbers, numbers that define you. Because for social media, for the internet, for your bank, you're not László Barabási. I'm not László Barabási. I'm my phone number. I'm my password. I'm my social security number, right? So for the system as large, I exist as a number, and these numbers uniquely defined us, right? You cannot change a number in that number, because if you change a single number, you become a different individual, and you no longer can enter in your bank account. You can no longer get government benefits and so on. And it's interesting that these personal numbers are very similar to each other. They're typically 10 to 12 digits long, because you need that many digits to show enough diversity to have enough numbers. And they're just string of long numbers. So we ended up building rollers that have in this case, it's my social security number in Hungary. Well, other rollers had my phone number in Hungary. And we also built what we call a dataism longer roller, which I will explain the meaning in a kind of a little bit later. So these were some of the rollers we used. As you see, these are very large rollers. These are kind of very wide. They're 40 centimeter in length, 48, actually 50 centimeter, almost half a meter rollers. And you can see me in action during the summer, working during art, actually, with these particular rollers. And again, the challenge was, how do you show now the fact that these numbers fundamentally exist and define us? but yet were not shown. They're not publicly available and so on. So we ended up creating a number of series. This was one of them where we were kind of rolling the numbers at different scale onto each other and even using kind of masking techniques over it to show that these numbers define your life at many, many different scales, right? They define at the local scale, which is kind of you need to give them to enter some accounts, but they also define major decisions in your life and access to resources and so on. We use them in like the one on the right hand side I very much like because we use gold and silver as the paint, and then we kind of covered it up mostly to show that the new gold in the modern society are the personal numbers. If you think about it, how does Facebook, how does Twitter, how does the big social networks companies make their money? By monetizing your numbers. Through these numbers, they monetize your content, right? So in a way, by using this kind of gold and silver is showing that the new gold is really these numbers that represent us. And on the left-hand side, you see other works that we're kind of experimenting with. And here's one. So what you have to kind of think about it, that these summer projects for us are massive experiments. It's not that we know right away what we want to do. I'm bringing to my studio the same perspective that I actually have in my scientific research lab, is that let's have the resources, let's have the minds, let's have the tools, and let's experiment. And not everything has to succeed. We have lots of dead ends in this journey, but then eventually things that start succeeding, we start taking them at the next level. You remember in the previous year, I showed you this idea that we use the roller not to put paint up, but to take it away. Now, in this year, we also took it back to this project, but in a different context with masks and so on. So just like in science, that ideas that successful, that they work, you end up reusing in multiple later works. Like, Newton's formulas are used by the whole scientific community later and later. Here, ideas and concepts in the artificial space that work, we end up reusing in later works. So some are successful, some die out early, but it's a giant experiment. And this was a 3-year journey for us. And we're now taking a break. Because I felt like I never really wanted to be a painter. Still don't want. This was a giant experiment for us. And now after 3 years, we need to take a break and assess where we are. So we ended this summer job with a big challenge to actually create a 10-meter long painting. Why 10-meter long? Because that's how the canvas comes, the 2 meters by 10 meters. So we ended up working till midnight for a week actually to finish this giant work that has all the rollers that we use over the 3 years. And it's a summary of all of them. And with that, the project is closed. We're going to have a big exhibition opening on March 5th at the Kunsthalle in Budapest that shows this journey, the 3 years work, but fundamentally this is kind of the end of our story of this one. And then it's not to say that we will never go back to painting, but at least we have to take a break for a year or two to assess where we are and how do we go forward with this. So as a final thing, I would like to actually, and looking at the time, I will show you 2 more projects. One of them is, as I told you, that I wanted to always become a sculptor. So how do we go in that direction? And one of the reasons we're stopping now painting is partly because I would like to return more aggressively to the sculpture space and or the 3-dimensional space. And this is a project that we're just finishing up. We were actually originally, this was a commission. We were applying for a commission actually to do for the Hungarian Academy of Sciences to show the different to kind of represent the Hungarian science space as a sculpture. And we ended up borrowing a shape that is one of the most best known Hungarian discoveries, which is the vitamin C. What you see on the right, what you see as a shape is nothing but the vitamin C. Why vitamin C? Vitamin C was discovered by Albert Szent-Györgyi in the 1930s, and it was extracted from pepper and Szeged, which is a city in outside of within Hungary, and it's a discovery for which he actually got the Nobel Prize. it was one of the first vitamins to actually be discovered. The concept of vitamin came from this. And it's also a very interesting shape. And we ended up creating a data sculpture where the colors, however, of the vitamin represent the 11 fields of science that the Hungarian Academy classifies as what Hungarian science does. So, so this is written in Hungarian, but what you see on the top is like linguistics and literature, then philosophy, then medicine, all the way to mathematics at the bottom as the source of all sciences. And this was kind of, as I said, it was part of a competition that we did not win at that time. But eventually the sculpture found the proper space. Turns out that Albert Sender, the discoverer of this particular molecule, has a beautiful but neglected square in the university town where he made the discovery. And so now they're renovating that square and the central, and they will put actually this particular sculpture in the middle of that. And this will be unveiled somewhere next spring. The design of the square, as you see, is done, and now they're just finalizing the process, and eventually will be somewhere next spring, the process of erecting this one. And this also is a data sculpture, so it will come with the QR code that if you look at it, then it will unveil the content of the sculpture, and it would even give you access to the Hungarian Academy website to see who are the researchers in that particular space. And then finally, I started with the Biennale. So let's go back to the Biennale and finish it there. And the question is, you know, how do you do a work of that scale for the Biennale? And what was really the concept that we did in order to achieve that? And the request came from from Carlo Ratti, who's the curator of this year's Architecture Biennale. And the opportunity was given by the fact that the Giardini, the main building in Giardini, which, as you know, is really the kind of the big curatorial space within the Giardini one, will have to be closed this year for a renovation. But the curator wanted to use the facade of the building because, as you see in many as you remember, if you've been there, often in the Biennale, the facade is used actually as an artwork, and different artists get invited to do kind of change the look of it. In this case, we did not have access to the building itself because that was renovated. So we kind of, the challenge was build something in front of it that replaces it. And for that, what we did is something similar to what we did in the art space. We ended up rebuilding the history of the Architecture Biennale. And what do I mean by that? We went back to all the editions of the Biennale, like the 1975 edition, right? Which was one of the earliest edition and actually was not even yet officially as a Biennale at that time. And then we said, who were actually what projects were shown, and that's what you see in this map, and who are the architects to contribute to that. So you see green is the project and red is the architect. So here is one project that multiple people contributed to, and then here is just one project, one architect, and so on. And then we ended up doing that for every single year. So this is 75. The Biennale was very modest. In 1980, became much bigger. There were many more projects, and each project had many, many more contributors. So not only typically that involved not only the main architect, but also the whole architecture firm who kind of contributed to realize that particular work, who were credited for that particular work, right? And so this is 1980. 1980 is interesting because this was the first that was officially called the Biennale. And then this is like a more recent one in 2023, right? The Biennale of the Future, the Arbiter of the Future. And you can actually kind of see that the same structure that we saw earlier, now it became the standard, that we have like a couple of major projects with each of them with many, many contributors. So we did this for every single year, and you see kind of as a table each year how many architects were invited and how many projects. So left-hand side, you see the number of architects, that the number of contributors, And on the right-hand side, you see the number of the projects or architects. And you see they very, very widely from year to year. The graph on the left-hand side shows this variability. And the challenge was that how do you turn this data into something that would be actually on that facet of that, and what you see actually some of the early concept that we had of how that world would look like. You know, we had many concepts. At the end, this is not how it looks like. At the end, looks like that. And then let me walk you through what do we have on this particular ones. And the best way to start is start on the bottom left here, on the bottom left here, because that kind of gives us the key to the top as well. So what you see here is what I showed you earlier. Each biennale is shown as a different network. You see, each circle corresponds to one particular biennale. If you go close, you will see here around the circle saying what was the year, who was the curator, what was the title. And it's the same visual language that I showed you earlier. Projects shown as hexagon, contributors as circles, and they're kind of each contributor is linked to the circle they belong to, right? And in the way, this is showing independently each biennale. And then if you go close, then many of the notes have names and showing actually who were the contributors, who were the architects, but not all. And why we couldn't put all? Because that would have been too cluttered. So then the question is, how do you decide whose name do you show and whose names do you actually ignore? And the title of this year's Biennale is, you know, Architecture's Artificial Intelligence, which is artificial and natural. So, which are artificial obviously is a nod to the AI. So we ended up using AI. We ran through every single name on that list who participated in the Biennale, and we asked ChatGPT to first, do you recognize this person as an architect? And could you rank them 1 to 10 how important architect they are? And he did a very good job at it. And out of the 20,000 people who were at the Biennale, it recognized about 3,000 of them as architects. So those 3,000 who were recognized by ChatGPT as architects are now shown on the map. Everybody else is shown on the list. So these little letters around the map are the full list of participants in all the biennales. And I want to highlight the black names over there. Some of them are shown in dark black. Those are very important for us. Those are individuals who participated in multiple biennales. Why is that important? Because through those individuals, these circles are no longer independent of each other, because the same person could emerge in multiple circles by being in multiple biennales. So really, these are not independent networks. This is one big network if you properly present it. And that one big network is now shown on the top, right? Of how interconnected the different biennales. So we're going from left to right historically, and each color corresponds to the different years. And now if an artist is in multiple years, then it will be placed somewhere between those years. And at the end, what you see here, this was the final map that we ended up building from that. And this is really a three-dimensional object. So this is the video that is showing the evolution of this map in time from one biennale to the other one. You see different colors emerge one by one, but some of the notes are on the right-hand side because those are the people who participated in multiple biennales, so they have to be in between. And at the end, you end up with this three-dimensional object that was shown as a video on the side of the project. So there's a video that you can actually see, and you can see from what countries and what continents the different people come from. So there's also a sociological characterization of that. And then, of course, at the end, the big map was shown on the top. And I love this video because it's showing how this went up over there. How it's kind of the work that it takes to really kind of create one of these objects. You don't often think about it, the physicality of making them happen. And I also like this video that you will, hopefully this will
So like, no, let me just kind of stop it there and then say, this was the final project or the final look of it. We have these smaller maps, we have the big maps, and inside we have also a more detailed characterization built by Paolo Ciuccalcelli, who's one of my colleagues here at Tiston, to kind of show the evolution of the selection process that year. So kind of coming to the very end, this is now at the very end. I thought we agreed that I'd speak about 90 minutes. Let me just kind of reflect of what do I think of what we are doing. And I personally think that we're doing a form of art in my lab that I occasionally call dataism. Dataism is a movement that has been emerging slowly since the 1960s, but really prominently in the 2000s and after, which is kind of, it's an artistic practice that acknowledges that data really became the humanity's principal ways of understanding nature, to characterize social processes, to develop new technologies, and increasingly to probe what makes us human. And in the same way, back at Leonardo time, who was himself both a scientist and an artist, right? And he chose to make to cut up cadavers to understand how to represent reality. At that time, the artistic frontier of representing reality was to understand the muscles, to understand the skins, to understand the bones, so that you can represent on a painting or in the sculpture the reality of the body. Today, if Leonardo would be alive, probably would do so through data and science, because our current reality is defined by numbers. Where do you go? What do you buy? What do you have access to? What do you study? It's all defined by numbers that are largely invisible to you. And so dataism is artists' attempt to really capture that underlying reality and through numbers and through data to kind of give a different perspective of the world. And I really think that what my lab does is really a form of dataism. Our particular dataism is one that has data fidelity, in the sense that you can look at our works and find out, kind of connect back to the original data. Not all artists do that, but ours is like that. Refik Anatol is a good example who kind of breaks the connection between the data and the final works, in the sense that he uses data as input. But once you look at the output, it's very hard to go back to the original data sets. So there's many ways of doing dataism, but what is common between us is that we all kind of use data as the beginning of our journey, and then the different artistic tools and mediums and manifestations to show some form of social, physical, biological, psychological reality. And if you want to learn more about it, if you search for the dataism and my name, you will actually find this essay that I published in ArtNet a few years ago, to kind of outlining the presence of this movement. And of course, if you want to learn even more, you can actually find on Amazon and other places our catalog, Hidden Patterns, as well as I've written a book a few years ago that talks about artistic success and many of the network-based phenomena to look at success. And many more is available in our lab under the Art tab. So if you go to our lab websites, we have a Science and the Art tab. If you choose the Art tab, you will see access to our works and exhibitions and so on. And of course, needless to say, if you want to, many of you are, I understand, from Italy. So this book is also available in Italian if you want to learn more about it. And thank you very much for attention. I'm happy to stop at this moment.
Thank you very much, Professor Barabási, for this really interesting and insightful lecture. I think this work, like combining the scientific research and also the artistic one, it's really a new key of lecture of all these different aspects of our life that you already said. And of course, this is the time for questions. So if you want to take the floor and just talk with us, you are free to do that, or also to use the chat as well. And yeah, so just feel free to ask questions. if you have. So the first one says, which types of data do you find most difficult to represent efficiently, and why? And how do you decide which connections are worth highlighting in a complex system?
That's a very, very good question. And you know, many artists engage with data and also with networks. And often they struggle because they actually get some access from the internet or from somebody. And it's a very difficult job on one end to kind of often clean the data. And most important, to conceptualize the data. This, what aspect of the data do you want to show? What is really the interesting part of it? We are in a very luxurious situation that all our artwork emerges in the scientific context. So we actually have a science team that before we do any art, we analyze in the data and we try to kind of extract a salient picture. We build a story using the tools of data science and network science. And in parallel, with building that particular story, we start kind of conceptualizing how you represent. Data visualization is a storytelling. Also, scientific papers are storytelling, and scientific discovery is always a storytelling. So the journey for us of the data is that always starts out, even if we're kind of working within the artistic concepts, the data begins with the science team who analyzes, cleans, and conceptualizes it together with the designers, and then moves slowly, gradually over to the design team, where then it kind of finds its final shape. And so the decisions of what should be shown, whether there is a link or how we conceptualize a link, what data points to keep, what to ignore, how to tell the story, often emerge through the scientific analysis, and there is no one size fits all. And I often kind of give in my lectures, like in my kind of class, that example, that depending on the questions, different type of networks are relevant for you, right? Even in the social network context, if you just connect who meets whom, you will get a network that is relevant for example, the spread of COVID or other type of, you know, like airborne viruses. However, if you care about the spread of AIDS, those linkages are not enough. You need to have actually the linkages that connect people sexually, right? So different type of data is telling you different stories. And the same is true for the data visualization and the data art that we do, right? And fundamentally, the data begins the journey science team, conceptualized over there, and then eventually goes into the hand of design team, where we are now searching how do you tell the story that you're telling with this? What is the medium? What is the mode of representation that best extracts the information from the data?
Thank you. We have other two questions. What software do you use to visualize the networks, and if you have constructed them your own?
Sure. So that's a great question, right? And there are a number of tools that we also use to kind of build that. Probably the most prominent is Cytoscape and Gephi. These are the most widely used ones. These are very easy to use tools, and they actually are very versatile, and they can generate gorgeous visualizations. These work anywhere between a small number of nodes, a few hundred, to a few thousand. Once you start getting close to the 10,000 marks, not only that these tools slow down, but they become more and more difficult to use. So if you go beyond 10,000, like some of the networks, like the Art Network, the Nature 150 projects are, these tools become unusable. So then we start developing our own tools for that. But typically, these projects are never just a point and click one. A major project like Nature 150 or the Art Network, it takes only the visualization parts about 6 months to emerge, of building the codes, deciding actually what would be the visual language, then prototyping that visual language, finding out the right colors, finding out the final layout, and then producing the final renders, and then going back if you don't like it and starting over, right, is often a very big journey. So if you have a very large network, then it's a long journey. I often tell people who come to us to do data visualizations to say, if you have 1,000 or fewer nodes, you don't need us. Because the standard tools that are available can do a very good job, and then use your intuition and your artistic sense to get the final product. 1,000 to 10,000, you could do it with effort. Over 10,000, you probably can't do it unless you have the same skill set that we do in our lab, and it will be a 6-month project, right? Now, you may ask, could we actually share the tools for what I did for Nature 150, and would that be useful? Yes, we do actually. When people ask for it, we share it. They're not particularly useful. Those tool set was very much tailored to that particular data set and the challenges that were. So that was a tool built for that. And then the other interesting thing that people don't think about it is that tools age. So we think of a painting as being unique because you cannot do more of it, but we think of a data visualization as not being unique because at any time I can click again and create another one. Not the case. What we find actually, the software we use and we build for that and the auxiliary tools we use age. And effectively, 3 years later, if you want to go back, you cannot use it any longer. You have to rebuild it. So now we are in the habit that if we do a project that is bordering the art space, then we create final prints at that moment when we finish the project, and we freeze the project. We create very high resolution prints. And because we know that if 2 years from now, a museum will come back to us and say, I need now a 10-meter big version. Can you generate it? We cannot do it any longer, right? We have to do it at the moment when the software is still working. And that's something is not appreciated by people, that these are not forever, right? The tools that we built are very much for the moment and for the project.
Thank you very much. We have other questions here. So in your opinion, what are 3 fundamental guidelines for scholars working with information visualization in the field of digital humanities, especially when dealing with opaque data, often marked by ambiguity and uncertainty?
Yes. So first of all, I always tell my students and my postdocs that there is no perfect data. And by the time the data becomes complete and accurate, you will have missed all the discoveries, because discoveries are made based on noisy, incomplete, and dirty data, right? And that's a normal process. And don't be afraid of incomplete and dirty data. Just make sure that you understand what are the limits of this data, and what are the questions that you can answer based on that data, and what is the questions you cannot. So coming back to your question, digital humanities, we deal with lots of data that is either incomplete or it's not necessarily accurate. And it has noise in it, has false positive, false negatives, and so on. And then the question is, should we wait until the data is complete? By no means. Rather, make sure you understand the limitations of the data and make sure that your study and your visualization are robust to that. So for example, if your study is showing that that you don't have, for whatever reason, data is truncated and you cannot see the hops in your data, then don't explore the role of the hops in your data set, because your hops are missing from that, right? Don't try to draw conclusions that pertain the hops or the role of the hops, because those conclusions will be inherently faulty. So this kind of comes the arts of the science, right? Is to figure out what is that I can safely say with my data, and what is the claims that I cannot make with the existing data. And then the data visualization is just a different way of telling the same story. What is the type of things that I can emphasize based on this data, because I know that on that concept I have accuracy? And what is the aspect of the data that I should not highlight in my data visualization, because that is the result of noise or data incompleteness and so on. But as an advice, I would say, don't be scared of incomplete and noisy data, because that's the data from which we make the discoveries.
Thank you again. So other questions. In your research and work, do you primarily work with tabular data or with graph structured data? And how does this methodological choice affect the design and interpretation of the resulting visualization?
Mm-hmm. We work with any data in any format and in any way of storing that is available. Right? We often tell our collaborators or who are giving us data, we don't care how you give us your data. What matters is we understand how the data was collected and what it represents. It's often tabular and we turn it into networks, right? So let me give the example that I already explained to you, which is the exhibition data. That was inherently tabular data. It was showing when an artist was exhibited and where, right? It was just it's a giant Excel sheet. At the end, we turned it into a giant network, right? By connecting the institutions through the specific exhibitions and then connecting the artists and so on. So the way the data is being stored and being provided us is totally irrelevant for us. Because we're gonna build the code anyway to reinterpret the data and rethink its meaning and then extract the knowledge from data. And I think typically that this is not unique to us. I think data scientists are typically kind of as I would say, they eat everything, right? And you can bring us in any format. If we see the gold in there, we're gonna find it.
Thanks. So there is one last question. I don't know if you want to read it by yourself or because there are some.
I don't have those things on the screen,
so, okay,
so feel free to do.
Have you ever worked with embeddings? T-SNE, PCA, UMAP are all methods able to reduce complexity and draw semantic relations on 2D or 3D space, but these are just nodes in space. Have you ever tried to visualize links and relations between this kind of data?
Very good question. We do work in the science lab with UMAPs for the same purpose as you are asking, is to kind of reduce data and understand the relationship between them. As you know, UMAPs are typically offer very high dimensional representations of associations between the data points. And we also find them useful for a quick and dirty look. Also, we find them useful in the science space because scientists have got comfortable of looking at UMAPs and extracting information from that. We have not yet used in the artistic practice them, nor did we use actually for data reduction, mostly for just a quick look. It doesn't mean that we will never. I actually like the aesthetics of the UMAPs. And I think one day we should find out to do something with that and repurpose it in the art space in a proper way. But so far we have not kind of had a chance to do that. But it's actually a good idea to try to do that. So, but I'm sure the moment will come.
Okay, there are no more questions, but I would like to ask you if what are the main challenges that you think there will be in the future in visualizing data and of course in complex networks as well?
Well, I mean, I think that the challenge that we're facing now is the size, right? Because at the end, the data sets that are coming towards us are so massive that they're virtually impossible to show. So, and that's where actually the quantitative tools are becoming important. And that's where the traditional artists sadly will be lost unless they have very strong quantitative tools. Because what do you do with a very, very massive data? You need quantitative tools to subselect the part of the data that is interesting. You need tools to subselect the part of the network that you will show because you cannot show everything, right? If you, our limit of how far we can show a network is about 1 million nodes, and we have AI-based tools to lay out 1 million nodes, and that's kind of our record. But you know, the internet has billions of nodes, or the World Wide Web has billions of nodes. So actually, the World Wide Web size is estimated now in the trillions. How would you ever even attempt to show the architecture of the World Wide Web? In 1999, we created a map of the World Wide Web, but that was a sample of 300,000 nodes out of about 100 million that existed at that time. Today, you will need to use actually subsampling and very specific tools to say, how do I tell my story? How do I subselect? And so that means that you may engage with the whole data. Google may have access to the trillion node graph that is using to kind of build its search engine, but it can never show it as one big graph, right? And so the challenge, I think, for all of us will be on one end is to kind of figure out how do you subsample, how do you tell a story about those massive data sets that is still meaningful, and it's the right story and not just a random story that you extracted randomly from that big one. And I'm personally very excited also about data physicalization, and I've showed you some examples, which is to kind of take the data out of the computer screen and start showing it in a space that we have a different way to interact with it, that we can relate humans in many different ways. So one of the big projects, as I said, that now that we finished the 3 years of painting, is for us to develop the tool set to really represent large networks in space where they can encode data. So they are not just artistic representations like the beautiful networks that Thomas Saraceno does or Shiota does. Those are very beautiful networks, but they don't carry data, right? They don't carry information. They are what they are, artistic journey and aesthetic journeys, right? And the question would be, how would you do the same, but carry the content that to have data fidelity? So that's, for example, one of the current challenges, one of the projects in the lab that we actually started last week with the new designer and together working with the scientists to develop the materiality and the methodology to be able to modularly build very, very large networks.
Thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I think we can just say bye and thank you again, Professor Barabási, for this really great lecture. I think it's really interesting, this kind of work, also to make data more accessible to a wider public, of course, because this kind of visualization of complex networks, it's easier to understand also for non-specialistic people. And perfect. If you have questions or if you want to ask something more, you can also write to the Digital Center email. You will find all our contacts online on our website. And we will maybe put you in touch with Professor Barabási. And thanks again for being with us today, and see you soon.
Hopefully back in Venice. Thank you so much. Bye bye, everyone.
We hope so.